The permanent marker I used to label donation bins had left a faint black smear across my right index finger that I couldn't fully scrub off anymore, no matter how hard I tried. After 2 years at the Millbrook Free Clinic, it had become something like a tattoo I hadn't asked for, a small, stubborn reminder that this was my life now. Sorting through bags of half-used antibiotics and expired Dever cough syrup donated by people who meant well but didn't always read the labels. I was 26 and I had a biology degree from the University of Pittsburgh that I'd finished on loans. I was still paying off at $340 a month. What I didn't have was a medical school acceptance, which I'd been working toward when my mother got sick, and then sicker, and then the kind of sick where you stop making plans for the future and start just trying to get through the week. By the time she passed, I'd missed 2 application cycles, had a gap in my resume I couldn't explain without crying, and had taken this job at the Millbrook Clinic because it was the first thing that felt like I was still pointing in the right direction, even if I'd lost a lot of ground. The clinic operated out of a converted hardware store on Allegheny Avenue in Pittsburgh's North Side, the kind of neighborhood where half the storefronts had been shuttered for years, and the other half were fighting to stay open. We saw patients who couldn't afford copays, people who hadn't had a primary care doctor since they were kids, immigrants who were afraid to use the hospital system. My official title was clinic coordinator, which meant I did everything from scheduling appointments to restocking exam rooms, to calling patients who'd missed follow-ups because they'd changed phone numbers again or lost their housing again. Dr. Annika Reyes ran the clinic. She was 53 and had the energy of someone half that age and the patience of someone twice it. She'd been working in community health for nearly 30 years, and she had this way of moving through the clinic that made every patient feel like she had nowhere else to be, even when the waiting room was full, and the ancient HVAC unit was making that grinding noise again that meant it was about to give out. I liked the work. I want to be clear about that because it matters to what happened later. I wasn't there out of desperation alone. I was there because when Mr. Okonkwo came in every 3 weeks to get his blood pressure checked, and always brought homemade chin-chin in a Ziploc bag for the staff, something in my chest settled into a stillness I couldn't find anywhere else. I was there because 12-year-old Destiny had been bringing her grandmother in every month and translating Haitian Creole for her. And I'd started leaving a granola bar in the waiting room on Tuesdays because I noticed Destiny never ate lunch. But I was also tired, in the particular way you get tired when you're doing meaningful work for not much money and not enough sleep. My apartment was a 1-bedroom in Carrick that had a slow leak under the kitchen sink. I'd been reporting to my landlord for 4 months. I made $38,000 a year. I had $200 in savings, and the clinic had just received a certified letter from the city, informing us that the building's owner had sold the property to a development company called Holt Group, LLC, and that our lease would not be renewed when it expired in 3 months. Dr. Reyes had told us on a Thursday morning, standing in the break room with a mug of coffee she wasn't drinking. Her face was very still in the way faces get when someone has already done all the crying they're going to do in private. I thought about the 47 patients we had scheduled for the following week. I thought about Mrs. Pham, who was managing her diabetes without insurance, and who had taken 3 buses to get to us, because we were the only clinic in the city that had a Vietnamese-speaking nurse. I thought about the donation bin I'd labeled that morning, and the permanent marker smear on my finger, and how it suddenly felt like a mark of something that was about to be erased. 3 weeks passed. Dr. Reyes started making calls to other nonprofits, to city council members, to anyone who might know of available space or grant funding we hadn't found yet. I threw myself into updating patient records, so that if we had to transfer care somewhere, the transition would be as smooth as possible. It was the kind of work you do when you're afraid, and you need your hands to be busy. Then on a Monday in late February, a man walked into the clinic at 8:47 in the morning, 12 minutes before we opened, and knocked on the glass door with 2 knuckles. He was tall, maybe 6'2", wearing a dark wool coat over a charcoal suit. Not the kind of suit you see at city council meetings, not the off-the-rack kind with the slightly too short sleeves. This was the kind that looked like it had been built for him specifically, fitted across broad shoulders in a way that was either expensive tailoring or very good genetics, probably both. He had dark hair, the kind that curled slightly at the temples when it got long enough that he clearly hadn't let it get. Late 30s, maybe 40, the kind of face that had probably been striking rather than handsome in his 20s, and had grown into something more than that now. I opened the door because we opened early sometimes for patients who had early work shifts, and I assumed that's what this was. It wasn't. Is Dr. Reyes available? His voice was level, not unkind. I'm Warren Holt. I own the building. I didn't say anything for a second. Behind me, I could hear the coffee machine gurgling in the break room, and Priya at the front desk opening the blinds. She's not in yet, I said, which was technically true. She arrived at 9. You can wait if you'd like. He looked at me for a moment with an expression I couldn't read. Then he nodded and stepped inside. I put him at the table in the small conference room we used for patient consultations and brought him a cup of coffee, mostly because I didn't know what else to do with him. He accepted it without fanfare, wrapping both hands around the mug in a way that made him look, just for a second, like a regular person who was cold. Thank you, he said, and then, after a beat, I'm sorry I didn't catch your name, I didn't give it. I don't know why I said it like that, I'm generally not rude. But something about the morning, about the certified letter, about the 47 patients on the schedule, made me feel like I didn't owe him pleasantness. He blinked once, and I thought I saw the corner of his mouth move. Not quite a smile, something more restrained than that. Fair enough, he said. Sylvie, I offered after a pause, because I'm not actually capable of sustaining rudeness. Sylvie Crane, I'm the clinic coordinator. He nodded. Warren. Dr. Reyes arrived at 9:04, and I watched from the hallway as her expression went through several stages of controlled professionalism. When she saw who was sitting in the consultation room, she shook his hand. She sat down across from him. She closed the door. I went back to work. They were in there for 40 minutes. I know because I watched the clock in a way I normally only do when I'm waiting for lab results. When the door opened, Dr. Reyes's face was unreadable, and Warren Holt's was the same as it had been when he arrived. Measured private, giving nothing away. He paused at the front desk on his way out. I was pretending to be very absorbed in entering data. Sylvie, he said. I looked up. I'll be in touch, he said. Then he left. I had no idea what that meant. Dr. Reyes came to stand beside me and we both watched through the window as a black car, not a town car but close, pulled away from the curb. Well? I asked. He wants to meet again. Thursday. She paused. He asked who the coordinator was. What did you tell him? She looked at me sideways. I told him her name was Sylvie, and she'd been here for 2 years, and she knew more about how this clinic runs than anyone except me. Another pause. He wrote it down. I didn't sleep well that week. Thursday came. Warren Holt arrived at exactly 9, again in the dark coat, again with that unhurried quality to the way he moved that suggested someone who had long since stopped being affected by other people's timelines. Dr. Reyes had a patient emergency, so I was the one who met him at the door. We sat in the consultation room again. I poured coffee without being asked. He watched me do it with an expression that was attentive, in a way that made me feel slightly self-conscious. I'd like to understand what the clinic does, he said. Not from the website, from you. So I told him. I wasn't trying to sell him anything. Or maybe I was, but not for myself. I told him about Mr. Okonkwo and his chin-chin, and his blood pressure. I told him about Destiny and her grandmother. I told him about Mrs. Pham taking 3 buses. I told him about the 17 patients we'd seen last Tuesday, who had nowhere else to go within a 15-mile radius that offered sliding scale fees. He listened without checking his phone. He asked questions, real ones, not the kind people ask when they're waiting for you to stop talking. He asked about our patient population, our staff-to-patient ratio, how we handled prescription costs, what happened to patients after they left us. At one point, I said something about how the food dessert 2 blocks over meant that half our diabetes patients couldn't access fresh produce within walking distance. And without thinking, I'd stood up and drawn a rough map on the whiteboard behind me, marking the grocery stores versus the dollar stores versus the pharmacy, where people could buy insulin for $25 a vial without insurance. When I turned back around, he was watching me with that same unreadable expression, but something in it had shifted slightly. I couldn't name the shift. I just felt it. You're good at this, he said. At drawing maps? At seeing how things connect. I sat back down and wrapped my hands around my coffee mug. The building's still sold, I said. None of this changes that. No, he agreed. It doesn't. I looked at him directly. Then what does? He was quiet for a moment. Then, I'm doing it for 15 years. I buy properties, I develop them, I move on. I want to be clear about something. I'm not here to be the villain in your story. But you're closing us down. I bought a building with a below-market lease that the previous owner had let run long past its term. His voice was even, not defensive. That's not the same as closing you down. That's the realities of a property transaction. The outcome is the same for our patients. He looked at me for a long moment. Yes, he said. It is. I didn't know what to do with the honesty of that. I'd been prepared for corporate language, for the kind of smooth deflection that people in his position usually deployed. Instead, he just sat there and agreed with me, and somehow that was harder to argue with than anything else he could have said. He came back the following Monday, and the Monday after that. Dr. Reyes started leaving us to it, which I was simultaneously grateful for and unnerved by. We talked about the clinic, about the neighborhood, about what a community health presence in a redeveloped area might look like if someone bothered to think about it carefully, instead of just clearing the block for condos. I started looking forward to Mondays in a way I recognized was not entirely professional, which I tried very hard not to examine too closely. He started bringing coffee from a place on Penn Avenue that was clearly not where he usually got coffee, too far from downtown, too inconvenient. The cups had a small hand-lettered logo that suggested it was exactly the kind of small-batch local roaster that a man in a $3,000 suit didn't frequent by accident. He brought 2 cups every time. He never asked how I took mine. He'd figured it out. You paid attention, I said one morning, holding the cup. He'd gotten it right, black, 1 sugar, the kind of sugar-to-coffee ratio that's slightly embarrassing to admit. I usually do, he said, and the way he said it made the words land differently than they probably should have. I went home that night and did what I always did when I was trying to avoid thinking about something. I reorganized the cabinet under the kitchen sink, which I still hadn't gotten fixed, and then I sat on my second-hand couch and made myself think about it directly instead. Warren Holt was handsome in the kind of way that probably caused professional problems if you let it. He was also the reason our clinic was losing its space. Those 2 things were not compatible with however my pulse had been behaving on Monday mornings lately, and I needed to be honest with myself about that. I looked him up that night, the way you do when you're trying to find a reason to stop thinking about someone. Holt Group had developed 11 mixed-use properties in the Pittsburgh metro area over the past decade. Commercial on the lower floors, residential above. 2 of the projects had included affordable housing components that exceeded what city ordinance required. One of them, a former steel warehouse in Lawrenceville, had been deliberately kept at below-market rent for 3 years while the neighborhood stabilized. That wasn't nothing. But there was more, and it wasn't as clean. A 2019 article in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette about a development deal in Homewood, where small businesses had been pushed out despite promises of community consultation. A legal dispute with a tenant advocacy group that had been settled out of court. The kind of record that suggested someone who was genuinely trying to do it right, and sometimes failing at the edges of that trying. I closed the laptop. I didn't feel better or worse. I just felt like I understood the situation a little more clearly, which is different. The following Thursday he arrived and for the first time wasn't carrying coffee. He sat down and said, without preamble, "I want to offer you a position." I stared at him. "I'm building a health and wellness component into the Allegheny Avenue development. Ground floor, corner unit, about twice the footprint you have now. I want it to function as a community health clinic, free or sliding scale, serving the existing population before the new residents come in, not as an afterthought." He paused. "I want you to run it." I opened my mouth and closed it again. "I'm a clinic coordinator," I said finally. "Not a director. You'd be a director. You'd hire Dr. Reyes as medical director if she's willing. You'd set the operational model. I provide the space and the funding for the first 3 years through my foundation, after which the expectation is that you've built a grant portfolio to sustain it." My heart was doing something complicated. "Why me?" He looked at me steadily. Because every Monday for the past 6 weeks, you've shown me exactly what this neighborhood needs and exactly how to meet it. You see the connections, Sylvie. You see the people behind the data. I can fund a clinic. I can build the space. But I can't manufacture the instinct you have for understanding what it actually takes to serve a community. That's not a skill I can hire for. That's something you either have or you don't. I thought about my biology degree and my $1,200 in savings and the marker smear on my finger and my $340 monthly loan payment. I thought about Destiny and Mrs. Pham and Mr. Okonkwo. What does the position pay? I asked, because I needed to know, and I was tired of pretending practical questions weren't dignified ones. $85,000 base, full benefits, performance review at 18 months. The number sat in the air between us. I currently made $38,000. I tried to keep my face neutral, which I'm not sure I managed. I need to talk to Dr. Reyes, I said. Of course, and I need to think, take the week. I stood up. He stood up too, which meant we were suddenly much closer together than we'd been across the table, close enough that I noticed again that he was taller than I expected even when I was expecting it. Sylvie, he said, not like a question. Just my name said like it was something he'd been deciding to say. I looked up at him. The clinic you have right now, he said, is good because you made it good. I want to give you the space to make something better. That's the entire reason I'm making this offer. I went to find Dr. Reyes. She was in the break room, and when I told her everything, she set down her coffee and looked at me for a long moment with the expression of someone who has already seen this coming and has already decided how she feels about it. Take it, she said. Anika, Sylvie. She cut me off gently. We were already dying. You know that. The HVAC alone is going to cost us $14,000 we don't have. The lease was going to get expensive, even if he hadn't bought it. She reached across and gripped my wrist briefly. If this man is offering you a real chance to build something sustainable, with real funding and real space, then the most honoring thing you can do for this clinic and everyone in it is to say yes. I said yes the next day. The transition was complicated in the way all things worth doing are complicated. There were lawyers and lease agreements and conversations with the city's Department of Human Services about our status as a federally qualified health center. Warren was involved in most of it, always prepared, always several steps ahead, but never making me feel behind. He had this quality I came to understand better over time. A kind of absolute steadiness that didn't read as coldness but as presence. He was fully in whatever room he was in. He didn't appear to be elsewhere. I was learning things about him in small pieces, the way you learn things about people when you're working closely with them, and they're not particularly forthcoming. He'd grown up in McKeesport, 20 miles southeast of Pittsburgh, in the kind of neighborhood that had contracted hard when the mills closed. His father had worked construction. His mother had worked at a grocery store, and then at a school cafeteria. He'd gotten a scholarship to Carnegie Mellon for architecture, which he'd eventually leveraged into real estate development. He'd been doing it for 15 years. He didn't offer these things voluntarily. They came out in conversations that wandered into them sideways, and once they were out, he would go quiet in the way people go quiet, when they've said more than they meant to. I found myself working later, on the nights we had evening meetings, not because the meetings ran long, but because I'd find reasons to extend them. A question about the floor plan that I could have emailed. A concern about parking access I was probably overthinking. He never seemed in a rush to end them, which I noted, and then told myself meant nothing. 3 months in, we were having dinner, a working dinner, very deliberately a working dinner, at a Thai place near the construction site because it was convenient, and he asked me something no one in a professional context had ever asked me. What were you going to do? He said. Before all of this, what was the plan? I wrapped both hands around my water glass. Medical school, I said. I wanted to be a pediatrician. What happened? My mom got sick. I deferred, then she died. I paused. Losing someone takes up a lot of space in you for a while. I couldn't go back to wanting the same things I'd wanted before without it feeling like a betrayal somehow. Like I should want something different now. Something harder to just want for myself. He was quiet in the way he was quiet when he was actually listening and not just waiting. I understand that, he said. Something in his voice made me look at him more carefully. My sister, he said after a moment. 12 years ago. She was 24. I didn't say I'm sorry, because I knew by then that he found that phrase difficult, that he'd been on the receiving end of it so many times it had worn thin. I just held the silence with him. After that, he said, I worked. That's the honest answer. I threw myself into the work so completely there wasn't room for anything else. It kept me from thinking too carefully about what I was building all this for. And now? He looked at me across the table with something that had shifted from the professional expression I'd catalogued over the past months into something more unguarded. Now I'm starting to figure that out, he said. I went home and sat on my couch for a long time. The clinic, which we'd named Northside Health Commons because naming a clinic is actually very hard, and we went through 11 other options first, opened in October. It was a Tuesday. Dr. Reyes was there, and Priya and the new nurse we'd hired, a young woman named Bridget who had come from UPMC's community health program and was sharper than she let on in interviews. Mr. Okonkwo came and brought Chin Chin. Destiny brought her grandmother and translated. Warren came at the end of the day, after the last patient, when the staff was cleaning up and the opening day flowers were starting to droop slightly in their vases. He stood in the doorway of the main exam area and looked around at what we'd built. The good lighting we'd fought the contractor for, the waiting room, with enough seats and decent magazines, and a small toy corner for kids, the 3 exam rooms, the pharmacy corner where patients could get their most common prescriptions filled at cost. When he found me, I was at the front desk entering patient data from the day's appointments. He sat down in the chair across the counter, in the position our patient sat in, and looked at me. How was it, he said. We saw 22 patients, I said. 11 had never had a regular care provider. 4 needed referrals we were able to place same day. Mrs. Pham only had to take 1 bus. Something happened to his face when I said that last part. A shift that made him look younger for a second, or more exposed, or both. You did this, he said. We did this. He was looking at me in a way he hadn't looked at me before, or maybe had been trying not to, and I was looking at him the same way, and the distance between us across the front desk counter felt suddenly very measurable. Sylvie, he said. Quiet, the way he'd said my name in the consultation room months ago, like something decided. Warren, I said back, equally quiet. I should tell you something. He leaned forward slightly. I came to the clinic in February because I had to, because it was part of due diligence on the property, understanding who the current tenants were. A pause. I kept coming back because I wanted to. That distinction matters to me. I looked at him steadily. I know, I said. I've tried to keep this. Professional, I finished. I know that too. Yes, he exhaled slowly. And I am not. I want to be clear that if this is not something you want, then it is not something that happens, and nothing between us changes professionally. I mean that. I thought about every Monday for 6 months. I thought about 2 cups of coffee with the right amount of sugar. I thought about him saying, "What were you going to do before all of this?" in a Thai restaurant on a Tuesday, like someone who genuinely wanted to know. Warren, I said, I have been aware of exactly what I've been feeling since about week 3. His breath came out slowly, and then the corner of his mouth moved, and this time it was the full version of what I'd seen trying to happen back in February, and it was considerable. Week 3, he said. The map, I said. I drew the map, and you said I was good at seeing how things connect. That's when I knew I was in trouble. He stood up. I stood up, and when he came around the counter, he wasn't hurrying, and neither was I, because we had both apparently been waiting long enough that there was no reason to rush the last 10 feet. The next 4 months were the best I could remember. Not because they were perfect. They weren't. Warren was difficult in specific ways. He worked too much, disclosed too little by default, had a tendency to solve problems independently before it occurred to him to mention he was dealing with them. He'd been alone for a long time, and he'd built habits around that aloneness that didn't always have room for another person. But he was also, when he was present, he was completely present. When he listened, you felt it. When he showed up like he'd decided to, and not like he was going through emotion. And he was funny in the dry, understated way of people who've spent a lot of time observing things rather than performing them. It took me a while to catch all of his jokes. Once I did, I couldn't stop catching them. I was happy. I want to say that plainly, because it matters to what came next. I was happy in a way I hadn't been in years, maybe since before my mother got sick, and I'd mostly stopped believing I'd find it again, and then I had. The thing arrived on a Wednesday in February, almost exactly a year after Warren had knocked on the clinic door. I was closing up when a woman came in. She was maybe 45, well-dressed, with the kind of posture that comes from years of carrying yourself like you expect rooms to rearrange themselves around you. She asked for Warren Holt. I said he wasn't there. She said she'd wait. Something about her felt wrong in the low-register way of things that feel wrong before you understand why. Her name was Catherine Bellamy. I found that out when she gave me her card, which said Bellamy Capital, managing partner. She'd invested $4.2 million in one of Warren's early development projects 11 years ago. The project had worked. Her investment had returned well. But somewhere in the course of that project, contracts had been structured in a way that had benefited Warren's controlling interest, at the expense of her minority stake by an amount that, compounded over 11 years, she had calculated at approximately $800,000. She wasn't there to threaten him. She was clear about that in the measured way of someone who had been very precise with her lawyer about what she was and wasn't going to say. She was there to inform him that she had filed a civil complaint with the Pennsylvania Securities Commission and that he would be receiving formal notice within the week. She left. I stood in the empty clinic for a while with the card in my hand. I called Warren. He answered on the second ring, his voice warm in the way it was when he saw my name on his screen. I told him everything. The silence that followed lasted 5 seconds. I counted. "I'll come to you," he said. He arrived in 20 minutes, and I knew from the way he walked in. The particular flatness in his expression that I'd learned was how he looked when he was managing something very carefully, that this was not entirely a surprise to him. We sat at the front desk, same places we'd always sat, and he told me. The project, 11 years ago, had been his first major development. He'd been desperate for capital, for the credibility that came with having real investors. Catherine Bellamy had come in late, after terms were already set. In the restructuring, there had been a provision, drafted by his lawyer at the time, approved by Bellamy's lawyer at the time, technically legal, that had allowed Warren's company to recoup overhead costs before calculating investor returns in a way that, while disclosed, had not been clearly explained. He hadn't flagged the discrepancy himself. He'd let it stand. "It was wrong," he said. "I knew it was borderline when it happened, and I told myself it wasn't my responsibility because her lawyers signed off on it." He exhaled. "That's not a defense. That's what I told myself at 29 when I needed the deal to close." I looked at him across the counter. "How many others?" I asked. He looked at me steadily. 2, similar structure, similar vintage. I've been in conversations with both of them for the past 4 months through counsel. This one, Catherine moved faster than I expected. 4 months. While I had been. 4 months. "You didn't tell me," I said. "No. Warren, I know." His voice was quiet and level and did not try to excuse itself. "I was trying to resolve it before it became something that affected you. It affects me because I didn't know, not because it exists." I held his gaze. "There's a difference between something being hard and keeping it from me. You don't get to decide what I can handle." He was quiet for a long moment. "You're right," he said. "That's fair." I stood up and walked to the window. Outside on Allegheny Avenue, it was cold and gray, and a woman was walking a dog past the mural someone had painted on the wall of the building 2 doors down, bright colors in February that looked almost defiant. "What are you going to do?" I asked. "Pay them back," he said, "all 3. With interest, my own calculation of what fair return should have been, not the legal minimum." He paused. "It'll be significant. Not ruinous, but significant. And the Securities Commission filing? I'll cooperate fully, disclose everything. If they determine a penalty beyond restitution is warranted, I'll pay it." Another pause. "I may lose my developer's license for a period. I don't know yet." I turned back from the window. "You should have told me," I said again. "Yes," he said. "I should have." "I'm sorry, Sylvie." He said my name the way he only said it when he wasn't performing anything. And I was still angry. I want to be honest about that. I was genuinely angry. Not the kind that dissipates in minutes, but the kind that settles in and has to be worked through. But underneath the anger, I could see what he was doing right now, which was sitting in front of me without deflection and saying, "Yes, I was wrong, and I'm fixing it, and that matters. Go home, I said. Let me think. He went. I spent 3 days working through it. I made lists, which is how I process things I can't afford to get wrong. On one side, he'd made a choice 11 years ago that had benefited him at someone else's expense and had not corrected it until pressed. He'd hidden an active legal situation from me for 4 months. These were real things. On the other side, he was correcting it. Not minimally, fully, voluntarily, beyond what was legally required. He'd said I was wrong. I'm sorry, I'm fixing it, without qualifications. I thought about the conversation in the Thai restaurant. What were you going to do? He'd asked like someone who needed to know. I thought about 2 cups of coffee for 6 months. About the lighting in the waiting room we'd fought the contractor for. About him sitting across the counter on opening day and listening to me say Mrs. Pham only had to take 1 bus. I called him on the 4th day. I need you to understand something, I said when he answered. If something is happening in your life that affects us, you tell me. That's not negotiable. I am not someone who needs to be protected from information. I am someone who needs to be treated like a partner. Understood, he said immediately, without equivocation. And I need you to actually mean that. Not just now, I know. A pause. I've been alone for a long time, Sylvie. I don't have a good habit of letting someone in far enough that there's something to tell. I'm not offering that as an excuse. I'm telling you it's something I'm going to have to actively work on. The honesty of that was the thing. Not a promise that it would be easy or that he was already fixed. Just, here is the real thing, and I see it. Okay, I said. Okay? His voice shifted slightly. Okay, I said again. Come over, bring food. Not something expensive. I don't feel like navigating a fancy menu right now. Get something from Primanti's. There was a pause and then a sound that was almost a laugh, the real kind that surprised him into it. You want a Primanti's sandwich. I want a Primanti's sandwich, and I want to not have to perform being fine. And I want to keep figuring this out with you. In that order. He came. He brought sandwiches, the full overstuffed Pittsburgh version with fries and coleslaw piled inside, which is objectively ridiculous and correct. We sat on my second-hand couch and he told me everything, all of it, the complete version without the editing. It took 2 hours. By the end I understood something I hadn't before. The early deal, the one with Catherine Bellamy, had happened in a period when he'd been moving so fast and so desperately that he'd set aside the instinct to be careful about fairness. The money he'd made from that project was the foundation of everything else he'd built. He'd known, somewhere quiet and honest in himself, that it wasn't fully clean. And he'd built on it anyway, and the building got bigger and bigger, and it got harder and harder to look at the foundation directly. The process of correcting it, the lawyers and the disclosures and the securities investigation, took 8 months. He lost his developer's license for 6 months, a professional suspension that wasn't a death sentence for a company his size, but wasn't nothing. He paid out $2.3 million total, his own calculation, more than any legal judgment would have required. He came to the clinic most Mondays during that period, not for meetings, but just there, reading in the corner of the waiting room with coffee, catching up on work on his laptop. Dr. Reyes stopped pretending to be surprised by this after the 3rd week and simply started setting a mug on the waiting room table before he arrived. We found a different rhythm during those months, slower, more deliberate. He started saying things before they were fully resolved, which I know sounds like a small thing and wasn't. He'd say, I got a call from the securities investigator today. Here's what happened, before he'd had time to process it privately. The first few times he did it, I could see that it cost him something, that it went against a long, practiced instinct. I tried to make it worth the cost. I also stopped waiting for the moment when this would stop feeling like something I'd stumbled into and start feeling like something that was actually mine. Somewhere around month 7 it did. It wasn't a dramatic moment. I was at the front desk entering patient records, and Warren was in the waiting room pretending to read something, and I looked up and he was already looking at me, and I thought, yes, this is the thing. This is what it feels like when it's real. When his license was reinstated, the first project he brought me into was a development in the Hill District, a historically black neighborhood in Pittsburgh that had been through decades of disinvestment and displacement, and now sat adjacent to a development corridor that was moving in fast. He wanted to build housing, mixed income, 2/3 market rate, 1/3 affordable, and he wanted a community health component on the ground floor. He asked me to co-develop the health center model. I said yes before he finished the question. Sylvie, he said, in that way he had. I know, I said back in the way I had. The marker stain never fully came off my finger. I stopped trying to scrub it away sometime, during that first year at Northside Health Commons. When I started to understand that some things mark you permanently, not because they damaged you, but because they changed you into someone, more specifically yourself. 3 years after a man knocked on a clinic door with 2 knuckles. On a cold February morning, I stood in a half-finished building in the Hill District, with blueprints spread on a folding table and Warren beside me, pointing at where the waiting room would be, saying we should fight for the good lighting again, and I laughed. And he looked at me when I laughed the way he always looked at me. Like I was something was paying close attention to. Like he expected to keep discovering things. And I thought about a woman who had spent 2 years labeling donation bins and paying off loans and sleeping badly and making herself useful and thinking the future was something she'd missed the window for. She would not have believed this was where the map led, but she would have understood, I think, that the best maps are the ones you draw yourself. In the middle of the thing, trying to show someone else how the pieces connect.